It was the spring of 1945, in the final shuddering weeks of the European War. Across the shattered ruins of a German village near the Elbe River, silence followed thunder. The air still reeked of cordite and burning timber. Smoke drifted in thin gray veils above collapsed rooftops. Among the rubble, a mother crouched with her 2 children in the cellar of what once was their home, their faces hollowed by hunger and fear. The artillery had moved on. The battle line had rolled east, but the echoes of war still lingered. Then, out of that silence, came the low rumble of engines, not the guttural growl of Wehrmacht trucks, but the deeper, steadier hum of American convoys. To the civilians of Germany, that sound meant the unknown. And for one starving family, it meant everything was about to change. The soldiers who arrived that afternoon were young, sunburned, and dust-caked from days on the road. Their uniforms were wrinkled, their helmets dented, but their hands carried something the Germans had not seen in months: boxes, tin cans, and the faint metallic smell of food. They spoke quickly, uncertainly, through interpreters or gestures. The mother, wary but desperate, hesitated before stepping forward. Her son clung to her torn sleeve. When the first American handed her a small brown package stamped with block letters, U.S. Army Field Ration Type C, she did not understand what it meant. Then he smiled, tore one open, and held out a biscuit. For nearly 6 years, Germany had devoured itself. Cities that once glittered with cafes and bakeries now lie silent under ash. By 1945, the civilian food supply had collapsed completely. Bombing had wrecked transportation lines, livestock had been slaughtered, and rations for ordinary citizens had dwindled to near starvation levels. Children survived on thin soup and boiled weeds. The average German diet had fallen below 1,000 calories per day. And now, these invaders, the enemy soldiers her government had called monsters, were offering chocolate, coffee, sugar, and canned meat. It seemed like a cruel trick. Yet the smell of that first opened can, the sharp tang of ham and eggs, cut straight through disbelief. The Americans, weary from their own months of fighting, had been ordered to maintain strict discipline with civilians. But reality blurred those orders. Many soldiers had seen what hunger looked like: gaunt faces, trembling hands, and children too weak to cry. For men who had grown up in Kansas, Ohio, or New York, it was unbearable. The U.S. Army's logistical machine, the largest and most efficient in the world, had delivered millions of rations across Europe, far more than the combat troops themselves could consume. And so, unofficially, quietly, the sharing began. Each box of C-Rations was a miniature promise of America's industrial might. Cans of meat and beans, soluble coffee, hard biscuits, sugar tablets, powdered lemon drink, and even a small pack of cigarettes. Packed in cardboard and tin, waterproofed, heat-sealed, and dated for 2 years of shelf life, these rations were built for endurance. But to the people of a defeated Germany, they might as well have been treasure chests. Soldiers called them meals in a can. Civilians called them miracles. For a mother who hadn't seen meat in months, opening that can was an act of faith, one that turned into tears as she fed her children warm food from the enemies she had been told to hate. Beyond that small village, entire regions of Germany were collapsing not only militarily, but also socially. Trains no longer ran. Power plants were destroyed. Markets were empty. The Allied advance had created millions of displaced civilians, wandering refugees with nothing but the clothes on their backs. American units, moving through Bavaria, Saxony, and the Rhineland, stumbled into scenes of biblical deprivation. In many cases, rations meant for combat units were diverted to hospitals, orphanages, and entire towns on the brink of famine. The difference between survival and starvation came down to one soldier's choice to open his pack. In the field kitchens and depots behind the front, quartermasters tried to keep pace. Each American division consumed nearly 700 tons of supplies per day, a logistical feat that stunned even their commanders. The highways behind the lines were jammed with convoys hauling everything from ammunition to chewing gum. And somewhere among those endless rows of olive-drab trucks, a handful of cases found their way to civilians, quietly, unrecorded, unapproved, but remembered for generations. Soldiers often bartered cigarettes for eggs or traded chocolate for bread, but more often they simply gave it away. It was not strategy. It was humanity. That German mother's story was not unique. Across dozens of towns, witnesses later recalled similar encounters: a quiet knock on a farmhouse door, a soldier offering food with a shy grin, a child clutching a can of fruit cocktail like treasure. These small acts, scattered across the ruins of Europe, did more to soften hearts than any speech or proclamation could. Where propaganda had painted the Americans as ruthless conquerors, the reality was more complicated. They came armed with rifles, yes, but also with Spam, coffee, and compassion. By late April, as the Allies closed in on Berlin, word began to spread among civilians: the Americans feed their prisoners, and sometimes even their enemies. Crowds began to gather along roadsides, waving white cloths not out of surrender but in hope. Children learned English words like chocolate, cookie, and thank you. Even amid ruins, those words sounded like a future. To many American soldiers, these moments were a break from the nightmare of war. They had seen too much death: comrades lost in the Ardennes, friends buried in snow outside Bastogne. Feeding the hungry gave them something war had nearly stolen: a sense of purpose beyond destruction. In their letters home, many wrote not about battles but about children. They described small hands reaching for food and the tears of mothers who could not understand why the enemy would show kindness. In one such letter, preserved by a veteran's family decades later, a sergeant from the 4th Armored Division described how he and his men gave away their breakfast to a group of civilians near Würzburg. "They looked like ghosts," he wrote. "We gave them everything we had. They cried and we cried too." That single moment, unrecorded in any official report, spoke louder than any victory parade. As night fell over that ruined German village, the mother wrapped her children in blankets beside the faint glow of a small stove. The can that once held American ham now served as their candle holder. Outside, the rumble of tanks faded into the distance, leaving only the quiet hum of the river. For the first time in months, her children slept with full stomachs. She whispered a prayer, not of victory, but of survival. And somewhere beyond the hills, the war continued, relentless and unforgiving. But for that one family, a different kind of battle had just begun: the struggle to understand how mercy could arrive wearing the uniform of the enemy. The answer to that question, how compassion found its way through chaos, would shape the story of post-war Germany itself. Because what began with a single shared meal would soon grow into something far greater, something the world had never seen before. The rations that American soldiers carried through Europe were more than just sustenance. They were a symbol of an industrial miracle that had transformed the United States into the arsenal of democracy. Behind every can of corned beef hash and every chocolate D-bar stood a vast network of factories, engineers, nutritionists, and logisticians who had solved one of the most complex challenges of modern warfare: feeding millions of men across multiple continents without interruption. It was not just food, it was strategy in tin and cardboard. The secret that left starving civilians in tears had been born years earlier in quiet laboratories and bustling assembly lines far from the front. In 1940, before the U.S. had even entered the war, the Quartermaster Corps faced a question no army had ever answered at scale: how to deliver compact, nutritious meals to soldiers who might be fighting in jungles, deserts, or frozen battlefields. Under Colonel Roland Isker and food technologist Ansel Keys, the man later famous for creating the C-Ration, a new science of portable nutrition began to take shape. Military laboratories at the Subsistence Research Laboratory in Chicago tested every conceivable combination of calories, protein, and shelf life. Each ration had to withstand extremes of temperature and rough handling while keeping a soldier functional and alert for days without resupply. Production on a scale unimaginable by European standards soon followed. Between 1942 and 1945, American factories produced over 1 billion individual rations, each one sealed, inspected, and packed for shipment overseas. Entire plants in New Jersey and Illinois were converted to canned food assembly lines operating day and night. Women worked conveyor belts filling tins with meat and beans. Engineers perfected pressure sealing techniques that prevented spoilage. Logistics officers calculated the caloric needs of entire armies in motion. A single Liberty ship could carry food for 500,000 meals. For comparison, the average German soldier in 1944 was subsisting on hard bread, ersatz coffee, and a few ounces of tinned meat per day. The contrast between abundance and deprivation could not have been sharper. That logistical dominance became visible during the Allied advance across France and into Germany. The Red Ball Express, the high-speed truck convoy system that supplied the front, carried not only ammunition and fuel but also millions of rations. Each GMC truck bore markings identifying its load, Rat C for combat meals and Rat K for lightweight packs. At its peak, the system moved 12,000 tons of supplies daily. It was this torrent of food and fuel that made the American advance unstoppable. While Wehrmacht divisions starved in pockets, American troops ate hot stew, coffee, and fruit cocktail under the same gunfire. Soldiers joked that the army could feed them anywhere. If you stop to fight, the kitchen will catch up. For civilians, the first sight of those olive green boxes was bewildering. Each C-Ration meal came in a simple package labeled breakfast, dinner, or supper. Inside were cans of meat, crackers, powdered drink, candy, and matches. To a starving German family, that was not a meal. It was salvation condensed. The chocolate bars, known as D-Rations, were designed to withstand 120-degree heat without melting and contained 600 calories each. They were bitter, intentionally so, to prevent soldiers from eating them casually. But to a child who had not tasted sugar in months, that bitterness was the sweetest thing imaginable. Many Germans later recalled their astonishment at American generosity. Soldiers who had stormed into their towns now shared food, lit fires, and brewed coffee. One widow in Bremen described an American tanker opening a crate of C-Rations and handing them out to children lined up along the street. Another witness from Kassel remembered geese heating cans of beans over a Jeep exhaust pipe, then passing them to villagers waiting in the cold. These were spontaneous gestures, unplanned, yet they created lasting impressions. For years afterward, people remembered the smell of those rations, the smoky meat, the metallic tang, and the faint sweetness of cocoa. It was the scent of life returning. Behind this quiet humanitarian shift lay a doctrine of supply that even the generals barely grasped. The American war machine ran not on conquest but on logistics. Historian Martin van Creveld later called it the decisive factor of the Allied victory. For every combat soldier, there were 8 support personnel ensuring that food, fuel, and ammunition flowed without pause. Railheads in Antwerp, Cherbourg, and Marseille served as arteries feeding hundreds of truck convoys. Portable refrigeration units preserved meat and dairy. Mobile bakeries turned out thousands of loaves a day. No other army could match that level of sustainment. And when the fighting moved into occupied Germany, that logistical river began to nourish civilians as well. In early May 1945, as surrender loomed, entire American divisions redirected their rations toward humanitarian relief. The U.S. Army established civil affairs units tasked with preventing famine and disease among conquered populations. These officers, often former farmers or businessmen, organized distribution points where locals could receive surplus C-Rations and flour sacks from military depots. Photographs from the period show long lines of civilians, mothers, widows, and children, standing beside olive trucks marked with white stars, each waiting for their turn. In some towns, geese cooked vats of soup over open fires. In others, they left boxes outside churches for anyone brave enough to take them. What began as isolated compassion evolved into an organized operation that would feed millions across occupied Europe. The technical sophistication behind these rations fascinated even the scientists who made them. Every item served a purpose. The biscuits provided carbohydrates and fiber, the meat cans supplied protein and fat, and the soluble coffee and sugar offered fast energy and morale. The packaging itself, wax-coated cardboard and tin, was designed to be waterproof and resistant to gas contamination. Each can was tested for internal pressure and vacuum seal integrity, ensuring it could survive months at sea. In a sense, these were miniature engineering marvels, edible machines keeping soldiers and eventually civilians alive through precision design. It was the triumph of science meeting necessity. On the front lines, soldiers developed rituals around their rations. They joked about the monotony, ham and lima beans again. Yet they hoarded chocolate and canned fruit as treasures. Many carried extra boxes not for themselves but for the civilians they might encounter. Some bartered for souvenirs, others simply gave without expectation. Those quiet acts of generosity spread faster than any propaganda leaflet could. The enemy began to see the Americans not as faceless occupiers, but as men who carried kindness in the same hands that once carried rifles. By the time Germany surrendered, the psychological shift was profound. For years, Nazi propaganda had depicted the Americans as barbaric, soulless machines driven by greed. Yet the first personal contact many civilians had with them was through an unexpected gift: food. That contradiction broke barriers of fear and ideology in a way no speech or radio broadcast could. The rations, born of science and industry, became symbols of mercy. Mothers taught their children to say thank you in English. Soldiers responded with smiles and cans of peaches. The front lines of war had turned almost imperceptibly into the front lines of compassion. But beneath that compassion lay a deeper strategic current. The U.S. understood that hunger could breed rebellion, that starving nations could turn hostile even after surrender. Beating Germany was not only humane, it was tactical foresight. The battle for hearts and minds had begun before the guns even fell silent, and it all started with a soldier handing a ration box to a crying mother in the ruins of a defeated empire. The true power of those rations was not just their calories, it was the message they carried, that even amid destruction, one nation could choose to build, not break. Yet behind that message lay an unspoken question that would soon divide the victors themselves: what happens when compassion collides with policy, when mercy becomes strategy? The answer to that question would define the next chapter of history and the fate of an entire continent. In the months that followed Germany's surrender, the guns grew silent, but another kind of war began, a war against hunger. Cities lay gutted, fields were barren, railways were destroyed, and millions of civilians wandered through the wreckage of their homeland searching for food, shelter, and identity. The American occupation forces, first trained for combat, now found themselves leading one of the greatest humanitarian undertakings in modern history. The same soldiers who had once stormed across Europe with rifles now patrolled with trucks full of rations, distributing life one tin can at a time. What began as small, compassionate gestures by individual soldiers evolved into an organized lifeline that would shape post-war Germany's recovery and redefine what victory truly meant. By the summer of 1945, American authorities recognized that starvation could unravel peace faster than any defeated army. The Office of Military Government for Germany, U.S., known as OMGUS, launched emergency feeding programs across the occupied zones. Warehouses once used for munitions were converted into food depots. Locals, still wary of their new rulers, lined up outside American supply centers where soldiers handed out C-rations, flour sacks, powdered milk, and canned fruit. To the Germans, this wasn't charity. It was survival. In bombed-out cities like Frankfurt, Cologne, and Munich, mothers boiled American rations into stews that kept entire families alive through the first harsh winter of occupation. For the soldiers who witnessed it, the scale of civilian suffering was almost incomprehensible. Entire neighborhoods scavenged in rubble for scraps of coal or potatoes. Children wore uniforms sewn from old curtains, their feet wrapped in newspaper. Yet amid that desolation, American food convoys rolled through the ruins like lifelines. Trucks emblazoned with white stars rumbled past shattered cathedrals, their cargo worth more than gold. Wherever they stopped, hope followed. And in that fragile hope, a new kind of relationship began to form, one built not on conquest, but compassion. The rations themselves became silent ambassadors of a new world order. Each tin of meat and each bar of chocolate carried with it a message that transcended language. The war was over, and America had come not to destroy, but to rebuild. It was an early hint of what would later become official policy, the Marshall Plan. But even before Washington announced any grand reconstruction strategy, soldiers on the ground had already sown the seeds of goodwill through their actions. A corporal sharing his lunch with a starving child did more for diplomacy than any communique or treaty could achieve. Compassion, it turned out, was contagious. As the months passed, feeding Germany became a logistical mission of historic magnitude. American supply officers, backed by the Quartermaster Corps, coordinated shipments from warehouses in Antwerp, Le Havre, and Bremerhaven. Trains and barges carried flour, milk, and canned goods deep into the heart of the country. Civilians were issued ration cards, and local mayors worked alongside American officers to maintain order at distribution points. For many Germans, this was their first encounter with the concept of fairness, an even transparent system that fed everyone, regardless of status or party loyalty. The occupiers were rebuilding not only bodies but also trust. The psychological impact of these rations reached far beyond nutrition. They redefined the German perception of the enemy. During the war, Allied bombing had destroyed cities, factories, and morale. Yet in the aftermath, it was the same Americans who extended a hand to feed the survivors. That reversal stunned a generation raised on Nazi propaganda. For the children who received those first candy bars, the memory never faded. Decades later, they would still recall the smell of chocolate as the moment their world changed, when hatred gave way to gratitude. Those memories, passed down through families, helped soften the cultural divide that once seemed insurmountable. But behind every act of generosity was a complex network of planning and policy. American commanders understood that food was more than sustenance, it was power. In a continent teetering on the edge of chaos, feeding the defeated became a tool of stabilization. The fed population was less likely to rebel, less likely to turn towards Soviet promises of equality through revolution. Food became the first weapon of the Cold War, wielded not through coercion, but through relief. The rations that once fueled soldiers on the battlefield now fueled ideology in the rebuilding of Europe. It was strategy disguised as compassion, and it worked. Still, for the men and women who lived it, the experience was deeply personal. Engineers who had designed those rations took pride in knowing their work had crossed from war to peace. Factory workers back home received letters of thanks from soldiers describing how their products had saved lives, not just of comrades, but of civilians. Nutritionists who once calculated calorie requirements for combat troops now advised on feeding entire nations. The invisible army of technicians, farmers, and factory laborers became the quiet architects of recovery. Their efficiency, once measured in tons delivered to the front, was now measured in lives spared from famine. In small towns across Germany, the relationship between occupier and occupied evolved in unexpected ways. American soldiers invited local children to their mess halls, teaching them English words for the foods they served. German bakers, using American flour, reopened their ovens and began producing bread again. Farmers, given access to surplus military fuel and vehicles, returned to their fields. Slowly, the smell of fresh bread replaced the stench of smoke. Each loaf baked, each child fed, was a small victory over despair. These moments, barely recorded in official histories, became the foundation of post-war reconciliation. As Reconstruction gained momentum, the simple act of feeding strangers became a symbol of something larger, the rebirth of civilization after barbarism. America's ability to sustain both its army and its former enemies marked a turning point in modern warfare. Never before had a victor assumed such responsibility for the vanquished. The U.S. had won the war not only with weapons and industry, but also with logistics, empathy, and foresight. In doing so, it redefined what it meant to conquer, not through destruction, but through restoration. By 1947, American food aid expanded beyond Germany to encompass much of Europe. The Marshall Plan institutionalized what soldiers had started in the ruins, the idea that feeding people was the first step toward rebuilding nations. Billions of dollars in supplies flowed across the Atlantic, including those same rations that had once filled foxholes. The legacy of the C-Ration evolved into a new kind of weapon, humanitarian power. And for the millions who survived the hunger years, that power left an indelible mark. They remembered not the thunder of artillery, but the quiet sound of a can being opened. Years later, one of those children, now an elderly woman, recalled the day an American soldier handed her mother a box marked U.S. Army rations. She said it wasn't just the food that saved them, but what it represented, that kindness could exist even in the aftermath of hatred. Her words echoed what countless others had felt but never voiced, that mercy, when offered in the ruins of war, becomes the purest form of victory. The story of those rations is not merely about logistics or nutrition. It is about the fragile, stubborn resilience of the human spirit. When every bridge was broken, compassion built new ones. When hunger hollowed the world, generosity filled it again. In the hands of American soldiers, food became more than survival. It became forgiveness. And in that forgiveness, a defeated nation began to find its soul again, not through conquest, but through the taste of hope.